with the former were things which I thought were quite extraordinary in the way they imparted a kind of new sense of possibility in terms of the relationship between the two countries. The first was, we've spoken much about 1979. I was on that trip from beginning to end, writing for the New York Times, and a moment for me, which I subsequently did write about, which was quite extraordinary, was in Texas. We went to see the Johnson Space Center. This is with Deng Xiaoping and his retinue. And then that night we went off to a little place called Simonton, Texas, where there was going to be a rodeo. And I remember arriving and seeing all these guys with huge stomachs and belt buckles standing around with giant plates loaded with ribs and beans and all of these things. And then out of a limousine pops Deng Xiaoping, and he heads right into the crowd like he was some Texas politician. And lo and behold, the next thing we all knew, two gorgeous young Texas nubile young ladies galloped up on stallions and presented him that famous 10-gallon hat, which he then very emphatically clapped over his head, only his ears, as I recall, holding it up from falling down over his entire face. And then the next bit of this drama was he appeared in a stagecoach, driving around the ring, and people went absolutely crazy. I mean, this was a moment, this was a symbolic moment, and this is the first time anything really of its kind had been broadcast live back to China. It was a signal to the Chinese that it was time to let go, that the US and China were entering a new chapter. It was a symbol to the Americans that Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese sort of accepted the most American of all symbols, a 10-gallon hat and a plate of ribs. And this was very successful theater. And we speak of branding these days tirelessly. In those days, we didn't know what branding was. That was branding. The next moment that, for me, I think captured the ability when things are done well, when public relations, which I'm not enormously fond of, generally speaking, but when done well, Chinese comrades call it propaganda, we call it public relations, but it can be done well. And this was when President Clinton visited China, what was it, 98? And I went on this trip, and I remember standing on the steps of the Great Hall of the People, waiting for him and Jiang Zemin to arrive, and they did arrive. And this, you have to remember, was, we're still in the shadow of 1989. And they stepped out of their cars with big smiles on their face, and sort of walked almost like a newly married couple up the steps into the Great Hall of the People. We all got inside in one of these cavernous halls for their joint press conference, and it was announced to the utter astonishment of everybody that Jiang Zemin had agreed to have this broadcast live, both radio and television, and it was. And it was an amazing display where Jiang Zemin was actually, he had no script that he was demonstrably reading off of. And Clinton, in his inimitable sort of a good old boy way, was really enjoying the banter. And it was quite an amazing moment because it was spontaneous. And it suggested that these two men were enjoying each other's company. They even broached the subject of Tibet. And it was on that occasion when Jiang Zemin suddenly kind of reined up and thought, well, this may be getting a little close to the edge. And he said, well, with your permission, let's move on. And Clinton said, no, wait a minute. He said, since you've raised the subject of Tibet, I want to say something. I want to say that I've met the Dalai Lama. I think he's a fine man. Moreover, President Jiang, I think if you met him, you'd really like him. Now, is that imaginable today? There was a moment. And it did bespeak of the two sides wrestling with difficult issues in a friendly, in an open, and in a highly symbolic and public way. I felt the first session we had here today was sort of like that. People were thinking out loud. It's really good. Before I end, let me just suggest that, all is not sweetness and light. I think, a couple areas where public perceptions are malformed in this country in regard to China. Or perhaps are, it'd be better to say, are of a much darker nature. Derived from, there are many things, but let me just suggest two. The question of the use of manipulation of visas, largely for journalists, really is toxic. These are the people from whom the American public learns about China. And if you hold them hostage to this process, which should actually be one that is done on its merits, it's not helpful for U.S.-China relations. The U.S. shouldn't do it. They sometimes do, and there usually is an outcry against it, nor should China. The cost is far, far too high. And I speak from experience. I have a lot of colleagues who really find this difficult to overcome, a kind of a sense that they have been, discriminated against. And I think finally, and I won't labor this point because it's too conventional really even to get into in great detail, but if we're talking about perceptions, I know we have different political systems, but I do believe people on both sides can agree. It is right to treat all of our people on each side with respect, and certainly according to law to the best of our ability. We don't always succeed in this country in carrying out that great mandate. And I think China, too, has a tremendous road to go here. And I think this, in terms of perception, these failures, because they're often very public, are extremely harmful. Extremely. I cannot underline that enough to the way in which Americans, and particularly politicians, perceive China, and it obstructs the work that the rest of us are trying to do to find constructive areas of collaboration. So with that, let me stop.
Thank you, Professor Xiu. I think that he touches upon two very important dimensions affecting the mutual images. One is how the leaders of both countries can affect the mutual perceptions between the two countries. And then secondly, I think that the media in both countries can play a very important role shaping the mutual images, which could be very important for the relationship. Our next speaker is Professor Zhou Qing'an. He is the Deputy Director, Center for Global Media Studies at Tsinghua University. Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. My point about the mutual understanding is focusing on how the mutual understanding changed in the past 35 years in the bilateral relationship between two countries. I'm studying media in the School for Journalism Communications in Tsinghua University. Let me just tell a story which happened in last year. There is an American TV drama which named The Final Destination, which showed in Chinese video website. I believe that there were very few people here in this conference hall see this film, but to Chinese young generation, this is a very popular TV drama. The story is about some brave American Navy soldiers hijacked an American nuclear submarine because they refused the commander coming from Washington to bomb Pakistan. So the first foreigners who visited this submarine and tried to buy the submarine is a Chinese diplomatic. And the Chinese diplomatic promised to give a very high price. The money was given by some anonymous Chinese state-owned enterprises. And during this negotiation, the Chinese diplomatic served many products to this group of American Navy soldiers. All of the products was made in China. So you will find that in this TV program, TV drama, there are so many content who the producer want to add into this TV drama. The impression from my postgraduate student, they deliver this TV drama to me and show to me. Fortunately, the producer refused to make the second salary, just stop the first salary, because at the end of the TV drama, the submarine go back to the United States at the end. But I'm surprised that nearly all the young generation who saw this TV drama keep cool. They think the TV drama is just a TV drama. 10 years before or 20 years before, when we talk about some American movie, some American book which describe, or some American coverage which describe China, they will have many heavy reaction coming from Chinese public to discuss about what the content of this mass media's report on China, which is positive and which is negative. The change in the past 35 years, the most important change is that the public opinion show much more stable position in the past 35 years. We can divide the past 35 years into several periods, like we have honeymoon period, we have very tough period from 1989 to nearly the beginning of 21st century. And then we try to seek the different position, try to seek the suitable description to try to describe the relationship between two countries, like G2, like China, American, or like stakeholder. But I don't believe this description is only because of the policy changing. Sometimes it's because of the public opinion changing. Today, the public opinion in two countries show much more stable attitude to its mutual understanding. They will become much more calm and rational to try to understand what happened to each other countries. And during this process, I think the media, of course, I agree with Professor Shah, that the media plays a very important role because they set agenda on the bilateral relationship. And the think tank and policymaker who give the opinion on this agenda, and the opinion will deliver to the public. And the public, because they have social media, they have much more multi-choices to try to select the information. They will give much more strong feedback to the opinion coming from the think tank, coming from the scholars, or coming from the policymakers. For example, when Vice President Joseph Biden visited Beijing, he bring his family to go to a Chinese restaurant and eat the noodle. So 4 persons eat noodle just like 79 renminbi yuan. This message was delivered by the US ambassador in Beijing in Weibo, Chinese Twitter. So in 10 minutes, as we observed, that there were more than 400 feedback coming from the Chinese netizens. Half of them said that this is very important symbolic to American democracy because, you know, so high position American politician spend so less money on their dinner. And half of the feedback would say that, could you please give us a price list of the security? So, which means that the mutual understanding, at least coming from Chinese side, are much more rational because it has much more factors inside this feedback. We have to notice the public opinion change in Chinese society. The public sphere shaping also influence the feedback to the mutual understanding between two countries. And I should say there are 3 perspectives that we should notice in the mutual understanding between two countries. The first is that we call it joint perspective, which means that each country, when they see their affairs, domestic affairs, they will care about some influence coming from the other country. Like when Chinese government, they talk about, the Chinese public, when they talk about the reforming and the opening policy, they would take some developed countries as the benchmark in the past 35 years. And they will compare the development between developed countries and China. And sometimes, for example, more and more books to try to introduce the law system coming from the United States, coming from Europe, to try to promote justice reforms in China. So like the books to introduce the super count in the United States and some of that. It's like a very popular book and not just an academic book. Of course, in the United States, we found that in President Obama's state address, China affairs is not belongs to the foreign affair issue, it belongs to the domestic affair issue, because he mentioned China 4 times in domestic affairs when they talk about the label, when he talk about the trade, when he talk about the business and the working opportunity. So at the same time, I think that both countries, when they try to shape the image in each other public opinion, they will pay much more attention on the joint perspective. They connect much more than before. The second would be the third party perspective, which means that to China, when they thought about the Chinese public, when they thought about the crisis or the difficulties in the development or the potential threat, they will think about Americans' role. For example, I don't know whether you noticed the news which happened in Tokyo. Chinese companies sell the missiles to Turkish military. This contract was criticized by Western, especially by NATO side. So Chinese media will pay attention on how Americans' role in this opinion to and the pressure to Turkey military, and try to see the reaction from Turkey military. To Chinese public or Chinese media, they have a feeling that how could it not exist, not the United States exist behind the crisis when China faced in foreign policy making. So which means that they will have, the third party will have a very important position to check the mutual understanding. So when some international affairs or some international news happened around China, happened in Chinese media, China will interview some American scholars or American officials to find the feedback coming from the important country that China take it as. The third perspective, I think, is crisis management perspective. As my understanding, there are 2 kinds of crises happened between these 2 countries. One is called face-to-face crisis, just like the collision between EP-3 and the Chinese fighter jet happened in South China Sea in 2001. In these kinds of crises, both governments show patience and smart to solve these kinds of crises. They used all kinds of resources to try to solve this crisis, which make this crisis can be solved peacefully and as quick as possible. But the other kinds of crisis is like one-side crisis that involve the other side. For example, when during the development of China, we will face some poverty problem, we will face some human rights problem. These kinds of crises which happened involved the other country's perspective or media's coverage. So in Chinese media, or because of the social development of social media development of China, more and more Chinese netizens try to introduce or translate the international media's coverage on China's affairs in Chinese internet. So which means that Chinese public policymaker or Chinese netizens will pay much attention on the other side's public opinion and take it as a factor to try to solve one-side's crisis. I think in these kinds of crises, the mutual understanding will play much more important role. So my conclusion is that we have more and more stable mutual understanding than 35 years before. And whenever the relationship developed, not only political relationship or trading relationship, that we have spontaneous mutual understanding developed from Chinese public, of course, because of media coverage, because of the elite understanding, and because of public opinion. And at that time, we will compare more and more things like China dream and American dream. Recently, we compared different perspective of these 2 things. And I think when, based on this stable understanding between these 2 countries, we can have more fields to discuss about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think that you made a very important point that the mutual images between China and the United States has been kind of stabilized. I don't know whether this is good news or bad news. Because if the mutual image is largely positive, of course, if they are stable, that's good news. If there are still a lot of prejudices and also stereotypes in the mutual images, if they are stable, of course, that's bad news. That means it's kind of difficult to really shape those old images. Okay, well, we can have a lot of discussion on that at that point. Our third speaker is Mr. Kaiser Guo. He is the director of the International Communication, Baidu Incorporated. Mr. Guo.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank John Hartman this morning for talking about the importance of people-to-people relations and how this is going to be part of the marching orders of Carter's century going forward, trying to do something about the situation. I would actually have a much less sanguine characterization of Sino-American mutual perceptions in recent years than my esteemed colleague here, Mr. Zhou Qingyan, offered just now. Stable isn't a word that I would use to describe it. If we go back a little bit, we've all been talking about the sort of 35 years since the normalization of relations. I think that it's fair to say that for most of that time, perceptions have been formed by, and the relationship has been really driven by elites on either side. Most of what happened in the early days happened well out of the public's view, often behind closed doors, through meetings taking place in great secrecy. Policy didn't have to pay too much attention to domestic, or not to domestic considerations, but considerations of public opinion. That has changed. That has changed very, very dramatically, and it's changed only in the last really six or 7 years. And it's changed for a couple of reasons. I would suggest it's changed for one, because of the internet, because of the advent of the internet and the ability suddenly for Chinese and their American counterparts to encounter one another in a setting where, in a disintermediated setting, one where we haven't seen before. Encounters used to be polite. They were sister city exchanges. They were, trade delegations from this state visiting that province and that sort of thing. And everything was sort of formulaic and nicely run. Everyone was on their best behavior. That is, best behavior does not apply when it comes to internet comments sections. It's never an applicable matter when you talk to Chinese, of course, through the 80s and the 90s, many young people learned at least English well enough that they were able to read what the other side was writing about them. And in the run-up to the Olympics, they were very curious about what was being said about their country, as Mr. Zhou pointed out. Very curious, and I don't think that led to anything like stability. I think that they saw instead a profound lack of understanding, of profound unwillingness to be empathetic. What I'd like to try to drive people toward, what I sort of see it as my mission, is to drive them toward a more informed empathy. I say empathy deliberately and not sympathy, because I think this idea of an informed empathy does not require one to abdicate one's own values, but rather simply to attempt to understand the context, to understand the assumptions that the other side is making, to see what the world looks like through your counterpart's eyes. It does not require you to embrace those values or take those assumptions to be true. That's what I'm hoping to move people toward. The fundamental reality here is that, as has been pointed out a couple of times, we know what we know, outside of this room at least, outside of that rarefied circle of professional or maybe passionate amateur China watchers, or those of us who've spent, as I have, ungodly numbers of years living in the PRC. I think outside of those circles, you can assume safely that anyone who knows anything about China knows what they know through the media. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with this, one really does need to be a very critical reader of the media, because biases exist. Now let me, before I go on and before you paint me as some sort of critic of the American media. I do not believe, I don't subscribe to some, crazy conspiracy theory that suggests that the American media is working together to demonize China. No, I don't believe that. Nor do I think that they do a particularly bad job in all cases. I think there are a very, very large number of excellent writers out of China. But what I would say is that, and I would actually further add that I would lay a lot of the blame, if not most of the blame, at the feet of Beijing for some of the reasons that Orville pointed out, the whole visa situation, for example, and it goes beyond that. I mean, it can be sort of the minor maddening things like ministries requiring you to submit questions that then vanish forever and are never answered by the archaic means of fax. You actually have to send faxes to ministries to have your questions answered, and of course they never are. It's frustrating. The opacity is frustrating. There are all sorts of things that are frustrating, but beyond that, there is, there are more aggressive means that of course, one would have to be positively sanely to be able to transcend, to be able to still write dispassionately about China after having experienced such things. But we must expect this because the relationship is simply too important. Because you are, as a journalist, you are shaping the very way that people think about this most important bilateral relationship. Why is it important now? There's always been sort of a transmission mechanism between public opinion and policy in a democracy such as America, or a republic like America. Public opinion translates through the ballot box into policy, or at least in an ideal world. In China now, with the advent of the internet, you have something like a public sphere. I won't call it a full-fledged one, but it's something approximating the public sphere, where once again you see a leadership that is much more responsive now to public opinion, it can take the measure of it, in fact, is obsessively, from Zhongnanhai all the way down to low-level county offices, is constantly taking the temperature of public opinion as measured online, and is more participatory, more responsive, a little more deliberative perhaps. These are all good things, one would suppose, but let's remember, that the unruly passions sometimes of the masses can very much strain, and in some cases constrain, the sorts of choices that are available to Chinese policymakers. This is not always a good thing, and we have to sort of be careful what we wish for. I want to talk about one thing in particular, since I'm an internet guy, and one element that has crept in very uniformly into media coverage of China that has, I think, really significant problems. And that is the over-reliance of reporters now on social media, and in particular on Sina's Weibo, on Xinlan Weibo. What's wrong with that? And first of all, we all know that it's rare now to come across a story written by a Western media organization that doesn't quote some guy with some strange handle spouting off his opinion on Weibo. It's come to completely supplant the old vox pop, where you go out in the street and you talk to somebody out there. Anything wrong with that? Well, actually there is. There's an awful lot wrong with it. And it's not just the fact that Weibo isn't wholly demographically representative. That's okay. To me, to my mind, this is an important enough segment that if it really were an accurate reflection of the urban, sort of reasonably wealthy, reasonably educated middle class, then that would be indeed valuable. But there's something more going on here. The first thing that I would point out is that there is a very, very high, let me just use something across fields to use the word Gini coefficient. There's a very, very high Gini coefficient of influence on Weibo, where you have about 16 individuals with 50 million followers or more who account for so much of the retweeted traffic. It's just not even funny. We're talking about a massive inequality of influence on Weibo. That is skewing by its very, very nature. A second and more sort of insidious thing that goes on is this. Now, how many of you here have social media accounts? The young folks here, of course you have a Facebook account. And when you post something, whether it's a picture of your kid, or whether it's some snarky remark, or even just a link to a magazine article you like, you go back there 20 minutes later and you see if people liked it. You see if people have reposted it. You see if people have commented positively on it. And if they have, a little shot of dopamine goes off in your head. You get a little pleasure from that act, right? Come on, admit it. We all have that. So too with people who are posting things on Weibo. Only they learn very, very quickly that the stuff that's going to be retweeted, the stuff that's going to get you followed, the stuff that's going to be commented on positively is not stuff where you've taken a serious social situation and you've weighed things in the balance and you've taken a nuanced view, you've painted it in subtle shades of gray. No, nobody's going to read that or retweet it or comment positively on that. No, if you stake out, however, a really strident position, and if you do it in a snarky and kind of humorous way, you're apt to get much more virality out of that, right? You know, hate is the most viral of emotions, as it turns out. That's unfortunate. This is a problem because it really skews perceptions. It makes people appear to be exaggeratedly cynical. It makes them appear, to be more anti-party than they maybe would be ordinarily. Because let's face it, Sina, as opposed to NetEase, or as opposed to Tencent, or as opposed to Sohu, it has a dominant political ethos to it. It is skewed right. Let's just, that's the truth of it. It comes out of the fact that it was always sort of a more reputable among the different news portals. It was the one that was for hard news, for serious news readers, and it was the one that pioneered long-form blogging and courted a lot of these these public intellectuals who are now among the big V's, the verified accounts who account for so much of the traffic. This is important. This is a way in which Weibo really tends to skew our perceptions. And, so we have people who, a foreign correspondent store in China that essentially has bought into the sort of cynicism that they see on Weibo and believe it to be reflective of a reality. I know that there are many perches from which to see China. I know that where I, work, maybe it doesn't look quite as bleak from the hilltop I occupy. But I urge everyone, I think, to be very circumspect when either reading things that simply quote Weibo or, informing your opinions about what the Chinese people think. Really discount this stuff. It's not an accurate reflection. Thanks.
Okay, I think that the score from the perspective of practitioner of the new media, I think that he raised also a couple of very important issues. I think that one thing he mentioned that struck me, because when I did my study on U.S.-China mutual images, I also found that it was very difficult to have so-called the empathy on the both sides, to look at things what's happening in the other side from the perspective of the other side. That is very difficult. Of course, it's understandable because even for individuals, I think it's very difficult to have empathy with each other, not to mention the country-to-country relationship. And I think he also mentioned this very important, very important role that the new media plays in shaping the mutual images. This is something new. I think that we should spend more time on that subject. Our final speaker is Professor Huang Wei, and he is a vice president in Shanghai Academy of Social Science. Ren Wei didn't feel well in this morning, so we were worried that whether he couldn't make it, but he decided to come and to speak. So let's welcome him.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to point to something on Dr. Zhou and Mr. Guo's points on the web, the social media in China, and then I will say something else. You see, we have China is the largest social media market in the world. We have almost 600 million people open their account on the web. It's almost 2 times of US population. And we have 100 million people open the blog and join very actively on the Chinese Charter. And among those participation in the web, very underestimated, about 20% contents related with politics, and 80% related with market. So it is a phenomenon of market, also a phenomenon of democracy. You can see some contents are very radical or very political, but the majority still buy their what they need on the web. You see, and the young students just make friends there, such things. I think more social than political, more economic than political, but still the political content is growing. And the Chinese government is recently trying to make some regulation to supervise these 600 million participants in these blogs. So give people some impression that Chinese government is going to control the social media. But actually, I don't think the government can control. It's too big to be controlled. But there is some necessity to control something. Maybe web is very good, blog is very good. Something too much, too good is not good. You see, like before 2008 financial crisis, we can see the speculation in those capital market. Very big, very, you see, all the people can play all kind of leverage in those investments. But finally, it became crisis. It means too big, too fast, you see. So, with some control, we make this web, this social media market more healthy, more sound. And the Chinese culture is different from Western culture. Is we always keep the middle way, not too left, not too right. Middle way always the mainstream. So if you control to some degree, to some extent, people can accept. You see, because there are a lot of rumors, there are a lot of, you see, exaggerated facts. People cannot find what is true, what is not true. So this is one thing I should add to our American friends, that actually Chinese social media is growing very fast.